You welcome.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you so much. Is there a laser pointer as well, or is it?
Yeah. So this, let's see, this guy. This is the pointer here. It takes a second.
Oh,
And
fantastic.
then forward back.
Okay, it's too fancy. Okay, great. Yeah, excellent. So thank you all for appearing relatively early in the morning to hear a little bit about parton distribution functions. Is there a way to get rid of that little bit at the top?
Yeah, thank you, Nathan.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, so you've had 1 week. I know you've been getting into things and so on. So hearing all about particle and nuclear physics. Maybe I'll start with a question, actually, just because I myself am curious. How many of you, perhaps the majority, do you consider yourself a nuclear physicist? Maybe like half or a little more than half. The other would say maybe particle physics, like high energy. Okay, great. Yeah. So it's also that there are some of us who occupy this kind of as a liminal space in a way where, okay, it's like I've got an arm or a leg in either side of that divide. So that's somewhat true of me, or at least it's been true of my work in the past number of years. My hope is to give you a little bit of an idea about PDFs. I asked Fred, and he mentioned, okay, there's been some tutorials and a little bit of mention of the subject. How many of you are familiar with it, or do you use PDFs in calculations or anything? A number of you, perhaps. Okay, good. Yeah, excellent. So already some of my work maybe is done for me. Hopefully it's not too rudimentary. Feel free to interrupt with questions, of course. That being the case, I'd like to start with yet another question, actually. You've heard about PDFs, or you've worked on them, perhaps even in some context. How is it that we determine them, would you say? How are they measured? Is anyone willing to venture a guess? Is there an optimal way of measuring them? Anyone want to? All right, your hesitation is admirable. So yeah, I promise I'll get a hang of this. So let's see. So next. Do I need to?
Yeah, just click the mouse in.
Okay.
Now it should work.
Okay, good. Yeah, so it's a trick question, of course. That's hence you can't measure the PDFs, of course, right? They're only unvaried from data, right? It's an inverse problem. I like to point this out, actually in general, because I think it's really one of the essential points. And I hope if you get anything that truly sticks in your mind after listening to me ramble for however long this is going to be, I hope it's that point, right? So, and I say that because it's actually not uncommon among really experienced practitioners in the field to speak. Maybe they do so loosely, but I worry it engenders a misconception about measuring the PDFs, right? So that's never done. And in fact, you'll even see worse. Sometimes people, this is a crudely hand-drawn thing that I sketched, you'll even see sometimes experimental data in an attempt to actually plot maybe something like a PDF ratio. And I don't know, without naming names or going into detail or anything, one context in which this has been promoted, I think in this field recently, is with experiments like fixed target Drell-Yan, where you might try to extract the ratio of maybe D bar over U bar from data that would either be from an older experiment like E866 or from sequest. And in practice, you can't actually do this, right? You can't genuinely directly measure them because they're inherently theoretical objects, right? So the best that we in general try to do is try to parameterize the PDFs and then try to solve them in what you might call a kind of grand inverse problem, right? And so the history of really the intellectual underpinnings for this kind of work has a very long history. In fact, the earliest beginnings of it go back to even the days before QCD. So I'll tell you a little bit about that. The subject is an enormous one, so it's far more than I could possibly hope to really canvas in just an hour and between a couple of days. What I hope to do, though, is give you some flavor or some general impression for the field. And what I'd also like to do is give you some sense for how the PDFs are kind of vehicle that let us go from the electron-ion collider up to maybe very high energies at places like the LHC, and in some sense back again with some intriguing interconnections and communication between the two subjects. So to give you a little bit of a roadmap, the idea, at least today, is to give you some gist, at least, of the fundamentals of the PDFs, maybe some stuff on the historical context, and in particular, the relevance to the EIC. And also just quickly mention a little bit about maybe the statistical workings, basically, of the PDFs. And crucially, an area that's gotten a lot of currency lately is how exactly do we go about the uncertainty quantification, which is, I think, a big sort of frontier in this area. That's today. Again, just kind of giving you something of an overview. Tomorrow, the hope is that maybe I'll have a little bit more to say specifically about really particle phenomenology. So that's where we try to make the connections to sort of the energy frontier, as we often say in this field. So I'll talk a little bit about the LHC and how it depends on our knowledge of the PDFs, and also a little bit maybe about some of the analysis strategies that are relevant for extracting the PDFs from data. In particular, maybe a little bit about some hotter topics related to machine learning. So I thought I'd also just quickly tell you a little bit about myself. I promise I won't go on and on about this necessarily, but so I'm a staff scientist at Argonne National Lab. I think Fred mentioned a little bit earlier. My research is kind of at the crux of some of the things that I'll be talking to you about today. So a lot, of course, is related actually to trying to determine the standard model theory, in many cases to higher and higher precision to enhance the LHC physics program. A good deal of that, of course, comes down to what I'll be telling you about. So QCD global fits and the determination of the PDFs. But also, of course, this touches on things like searches for physics outside the standard model, and then some stuff related to numerics and that sort of thing. So Argonne, for any who may not have heard it, it's the other DOE National Lab outside Chicago. The other, of course, that you know and love perhaps is Fermilab, which is similarly outside Chicago. So unlike Fermilab, however, Argonne is a multi-purpose lab, we say. So it's not simply particle physics, but we also have a very substantial nuclear physics division. And then a huge number of colleagues working on computation and material science and so on. So if you're ever in the area, I wanted to make sure I said, and therefore put it at the top, please just feel free to visit us, of course, if you ever get the opportunity. And also, if I couldn't resist mentioning, we're currently hiring a new staff scientist in my group. So if you think you're to the point, for those of you who might be postdocs or something like that, definitely feel free to reach out to us and tell your friends. So as I mentioned a little bit ago, the history of this field is indeed a very long one, right? So I think trying to understand the PDFs gets at our effort to try to comprehend the internal structure of the proton and of the nucleus. I'll say a little bit about that in a number of moments toward the end of this talk. So the earliest evidence for the substructure of the proton really goes back quite a ways, really back to the 1950s, in fact, where actually it was elastic scattering experiments at places like SLAC by people like Richard Hofstadter and collaborators that gave us kind of the earliest indications that the proton has some internal structure. And the idea of those types of measurements is, in general, it's an elastic measurement where you take a beam of electrons and scatter on maybe some sort of fixed target proton, and then look downstream to try to determine or try to measure a final state electron and a final state proton. And the idea, the remarkable finding that emerged in the 1950s is the fact that if you carry out a measurement of this type, what you see is basically the fall off of what we call the form factor that's actually related to the cross section for this process is in fact, in general, faster than you might have necessarily expected if you presume that the proton is sort of a fundamental hard object in a sense, which is to say that somehow the proton is a squishier object than one might have presumed. And the fact that that's the case is of course tied up with the fact that it has some sort of internal substructure, right? You can somehow smash the proton at higher and higher energies, and somehow that correlates, of course, to the measured angle of the final state electron in a measurement like this, and it has some sort of gooey internal structure. So that was some early indication that, okay, the proton is actually not a fundamental object. It may well have been. In fact, for a time, it would have been reasonable to presume that there was nothing inside the proton, that it somehow was indeed fundamental. That's one side of the coin. The other side of the coin was the emergence, not so long after, of what is often called, of course, sort of the particle zoo, the fact that you have many, many different types of hadrons, and the fact that you can arrange these into sort of multiples with some sort of group theoretic structure that hinted at the fact that there are degrees of freedom, like strangeness, for instance, inside these sort of hardly strongly coupled objects. So you have these two sides of somehow the same coin, right? The sort of group theoretic profusion of various hadronic states, as well as early indications of internal substructure from elastic scattering measurements. So the story, of course, continued from the 1950s into the 60s. And here we get toward the subject of this talk a little bit more closely. The earliest deeply inelastic scattering measurements, of course, where now the idea is not sort of the elastic type of measurement that I just mentioned, but one where, okay, again, I do some sort of electron-proton scattering measurement, and I only examine the downstream final state electron and nothing else. And the remarkable finding was, of course, the emergence of Bjorken scaling, right? The fact that I can perform these measurements at higher and higher energies, and actually you begin at some point to recover the behavior that one might have expected in the previous transparency, a sort of very slow dependence on actually the momentum transfer. That's indication of the fact that indeed the scattering interaction is from some sort of point like core sort of charge carriers that, of course, we now realize are the quarks or the partons, as of course Feynman famously coined. So how does this work? Of course, you're all here, you're interested in the electron-ion collider, so you're all obviously deeply enthusiastic about deeply inelastic scattering. DIS is somehow the canonical process, I think, for trying to understand the parton distribution functions. The generic process, as you all, I'm sure, are deeply familiar, is one where, okay, sort of schematically, I have a proton sort of here at rest for the sake of argument. Of course, you can also do DIS collisions as well. An electron comes in and it interacts maybe in some sort of neutral current interaction through the exchange of a photon or a Z boson with the individual quarks somehow resting inside the proton. Of course, they're interacting in some complicated fashion. So I've got some sort of electroweak proton of the quarks or of the partonic substructure of the proton. And I can write down a hadronic tensor for this interaction that goes like structure functions that, for the sake of argument, are essentially the deeply inelastic scattering cross-section itself. But then crucially, if I work at leading order in QCD, I can write essentially that cross-section as parameterized through the structure functions as these funky objects, right? The Fs that I have here, which are, of course, the thing that we'll be talking about for the next number of minutes. Those themselves are the parton distribution functions. And at leading order, they're just weighted, of course, by the charges of the quarks with which the external probe interacts, basically. And of course, the crucial sort of degrees of freedom, if you'd like, or the crucial sort of content of the PDFs is their dependence on a longitudinal momentum fraction x, the longitudinal momentum fraction that they carry of the proton engaged in the scattering interaction, and then some sort of energy, or if you'd like, momentum scale q, that's related to the virtuality, basically, of the exchange boson in this process that for which I write something like a proper sort of Feynman diagram at the left. And of course, what we do is we measure this type of process by basically measuring the structure function or the cross-section for DIS at many, many different energies. And as I'll explain in a number of moments henceforth, of course, our knowledge of QCD basically, and in particular, our knowledge of QCD as a non-abelian gauge theory with gluons that are exchanged, essentially unites the behavior at different scales. So in principle, what you'd like to do is basically measure this sort of scattering interaction at many different energy scales Q, and then that in turn tells you about the gluon content of the proton as well, because it's through sort of radiated processes like this that essentially you go from the PDF at a given scale to another. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a few moments. So of course, the structure of the proton is astonishingly rich. It remains a very intellectually engaging subject. What all actually is going on inside the proton, if you'd like to say, essentially the hadrons or the proton as a typical example are really a mess. They have some sort of valence structure that's responsible for carrying sort of the bulk quantum numbers of the proton, sort of the up quark, down quark sort of contributions to the proton. But then there are, of course, virtual QQ bar sort of C-PDF contributions. There's the gluon being radiated and reabsorbed, as I just described a moment ago. So to first order, what you could imagine, however, is that the proton is, roughly speaking, dominated. That is to say, its bulk content is made up by sort of the valence up-down contributions. And if that were the case, essentially what you would expect to see is that the structure of the proton is encoded, at least its longitudinal structure is encoded through the PDFs, would be characterized by a valence-like distribution that peaks roughly at 1/3, right? Which is to say that the individual valence quarks carry about 1/3 of the momentum of the proton. Of course, as I just said, it's much more rich than that, right? There are many, many degrees of freedom inside the proton. There are actually heavier quarks that one can, of course, produce as you essentially give more and more energy to the proton in a DIS-like scattering process. There's the gluon radiation that I mentioned, which can then also radiate and then emit sort of a QQ bar pair. And that sort of C-like process actually has a tail at very, very low X, such that this sort of naive valence-like picture that I just mentioned is complicated, right? So actually really trying to determine what's happening in this picture is what really captivates a lot of us still working in this field, of course. And the intriguing thing is that somehow our knowledge of the PDFs is kind of a clearinghouse for our comprehensive understanding of particle physics in a deep sense, because in some sense, especially as you go to very high energies, all of the sort of field content of the standard model to some level is engaged, right? And is present actually in the internal structure of the proton. Of course, we can talk about that a little bit more, for instance, in the discussion session later. How do we actually do this, and how are we able to get at this information? What we do is we let the intriguing properties of QCD do some of the work for us, right? So QCD as a non-abelian gauge theory has, in fancy words, a negative beta function, which is just to say that, of course, the coupling of QCD, the strong interaction, becomes actually perturbative at very high energies when you have very large momenta in interaction processes, just the opposite of QED, essentially. So what that means is that actually the theory is very, very strongly coupled at sort of soft, low energies at something like the rest mass of the proton. But as you go to very, very high energy interactions at places like the EIC or certainly the LHC, then actually things are much more weakly coupled. And so there I can actually use perturbation theory. And the other remarkable thing that happens is that this permits a sort of factorization of processes at very high energies and processes at comparatively low energies. So there's the introduction of some sort of factorization scale where I say, okay, if I have some interaction at very high energy, that's well above this natural factorization scale. And there I can treat the sort of physics as very short distance and calculate it perturbatively with Feynman diagrams. Whereas everything below that scale is comparatively strongly coupled and is inherently non-perturbative, of course. And there I have to do something entirely different. I just thought I would mention, of course, trying to really understand the validity of the types of factorization theorems. I'm not going to say too much more about this, but understanding them sort of from first principles is still an active subject of study that my colleagues and I remain interested in. So the QCD analyses that let us determine the PDFs actually somehow exploit this concept, right, in some way. So the stuff that I just described before at comparatively high energies, where the physics is short distance and the interaction is relatively weak, we can actually write down Feynman diagrams and we can do perturbatively improvable calculations to higher and higher orders, whereas everything below that is non-perturbative. And if you're talking about essentially like an unpolarized DIS scattering interaction, like I started the talk with, in that context, everything that's sort of in the non-perturbative regime, that we try to encode in the PDFs themselves. So the PDFs, basically, they boil down in the simplest case to some sort of matrix element, basically inside the proton that I transform, and that gives me the X and dependence on sort of a factorization or a normalization scale mu in this fashion. So this looks maybe kind of scary, but the basic idea is that what I want to do is parameterize this thing. Since I can't, up to my knowledge of the lattice, I can't actually calculate this thing from first principles for the sake of this talk, shall we say. So what we do is instead write down some sort of series of flexible parameterizations that might have some typical behavior and depend on some kind of polynomial parameterization of the X dependence at intermediate values of X, at intermediate values of that longitudinal momentum that I talked about a moment ago. And then I just try to let all of the world's hadronic data teach me somehow what this form actually is, what optimizes my description of the data up to my ability to do perturbative calculations as well at sort of the higher energy side of things. You may naturally ask yourself, look, the way I've written this thing, of course, is entirely general, so that The Q in this case is really essentially a parton flavor. And as I showed a few slides ago, I've got every flavor in principle that can contribute to this. So it's up, down, strange, principle, maybe even charm, and so on. So in practice, if I want to determine the X dependence for the X and flavor dependence for the proton exhaustively, I might need really quite a large set of different processes living, in fact, at a variety of scales as well to try to understand the Q-squared dependence in this as well. Yes.
I have a quick question.
Sure, please.
Since to get the
No, that's okay.
to get the experimental data, sometimes is it all from, I guess when I'm thinking of global fits,
Right.
I usually think about how challenging they are because each experiment has very I always say the devil's in the details.
Yes.
Sometimes they have different rapidity coverages.
Yep.
And we do, I don't know, like full jets instead of charge jets or blah, blah, blah.
Absolutely.
So how do you go from what became an experimental limitation to physics?
Yeah, so you've asked a really key question. So hopefully maybe by the end of the talk, I'll give you some impression of that, of course. But yeah, so essentially what you could maybe, before jumping too far ahead, I can quickly gesture at something. So maybe for the sake of argument, let's just use deeply inelastic scattering as an instance. So in principle, what you've got is you have many different sources of information sort of on the left-hand side of this expression, which again is leading order and as naive as possibly can be, basically. So yeah, exactly. You have empirical constraints on everything on the left-hand side, which could, I mean, you could slightly generalize this expression so that it's not simply unpolarized deeply inelastic scattering. At the EIC, for instance, there might be an interest in DIS jet production as well. That could give you some slightly different handle. But the idea is, so I've got some generalization of this expression to comparatively higher orders, and I've got factorization theorems that apply to each process that I care. And so the idea is that I have simultaneously and in parallel many different expressions of this nature that apply to different measurements. And of course, somehow, I think as you're getting at, the systematic treatment of the uncertainties for each of these different data sets and somehow will ultimately somehow propagate to what I attempt to extract on this side. So it's an inverse problem, and I have to somehow unbury the things that I've written in red from all of these different measurements. That I don't know if that's okay for now, or I'll try to say a little bit more about it toward the end, of course, but let's see. Yeah, I also wanted to quickly mention, it sounds like a lot of you already have some idea of this, of course, but totally practically, okay, what are the PDFs? How do I find them, et cetera, et cetera? Well, the answer to that in practical terms is actually fairly simple, right? So if I'm sure probably most of you, I hope, have done this, as we know and love, the Lezoux Accord sort of standard for the PDFs is such that on HEP4age, we can actually pull down sort of gridded parameterizations of the PDFs. And there's a very convenient interface that lets you basically invoke these things and play around with them in whichever way you care to do. This is a bit of a sort of basic hello world, just checking the essentially the sum rules, a number sum rule in this case for the up PDF. The fact that basically if I take a 0th moment of the up PDF, the up valence PDF, I should say, I recover exactly 2 because you have exactly 2 up quarks, valence quarks in the proton. So of course you can get them that way, right? And without knowing anything about the PDFs, you can actually do calculations with them. More fundamentally, of course, how are the PDFs obtained? Somewhat related to the very good question we just heard before, actually what I really need is I need an extensive data set, right, to try to get at the PDFs. And this is what I was trying to allude to a moment ago, right? So if I want to somehow understand the full flavor and momentum and X dependence of the PDFs, what I'd like to do is get as large a data set as possible where I believe that I have basically the perturbative calculation under reasonably good control, as well as the factorization theorem. So in a typical PDF fit, was one of the C-Tech fits that my colleagues and I are involved in, what we do is you can basically do sort of a Born level matching of all of the data that we try to describe. You can essentially match that to a parton momentum fraction X that's probed by that measurement, as well as a corresponding scale. And again, Q and mu I somewhat use interchangeably in this talk. And a sort of structure emerges from this plot. So some of the oldest data that we fit, some legacy data, we sometimes say, is actually the stuff actually at comparatively lower energies or at lower Q. So it's something like 10 JeV and below, plus or minus, sort of fixed target information. So some of this is deeply inelastic scattering data from places like BCDMS, before probably many of the people in this room were born, actually, including myself in that case, but also some neutrino data, of course, from the 1990s. There's collider data, of course. So the predecessor, if you like, in some way to the electron-ion collider was HERA at DESY in Germany, which measures this sort of trapezoidal stuff. And this is just the inclusive DIS cross-section data that covers a very wide range in X and a quite good range in the scale Q, which again tells us something about sort of the gluon content in a sense. And then at much higher energy, we have some of the more recent data. This stuff at the kind of this highest batch. A lot of this is actually LHC data, so stuff like jet production, for instance. And you'll also notice at sort of the fixed Q here, maybe inclusive W or Z boson production data as well that covers quite a healthy range as probed by, for instance, the rapidity distribution in like W or Z production, a significant range in X, basically. So the idea is I take all of this stuff and try to boil it down and include it in a global fit. And the result of doing that is something like a modern, or at least relatively modern, global PDF analysis. So of course, this is what something like the PDFs actually look like, parameterized in a fairly recent fit up to uncertainties. And what you can see is basically, okay, this is just these are the PDFs at something kind of proximal to the starting scale at which we try to parameterize things at a scale of about 2 GeV. And the colors basically just indicate the various flavors of the PDFs. And it's a kind of furball, right? Because what you'd like to see is this very clean separation among the various flavors. And there are regions where we can do sort of okay. So the blue and red are the up and down PDFs, for instance, and you get the sense this is just plotted on an absolute scale that things are really in good control. And here, because of the fact that I'm plotting at relatively modest scale, you see that there's indeed this sort of roughly valence-like shape, this sort of hump. Maybe it's not quite at X of a third necessarily, but it's sort of close there too. But then as you go to low X, of course, there's some contribution from the nucleon C as well. And so if things at relatively high X, at least at this scale, look relatively okay for U and D, and then this is the gluon PDF, again, at this sort of relatively low scale. As I go to low X, actually, it becomes really quite an awful tangle. And another obvious property that you may notice is, I don't know, taking as an example, the strange shown in green, the band is horrendously large, of course, which is to say that our knowledge of the strange PDF is fairly limited still, and remains obviously an area of active focus to try to get at this. What you can also clearly see, especially if you look at other C flavors, so D bar and U bar, these additional colors down here, you can tell that they're sort of very badly ensnared with each other. So trying to somehow distinguish the strange PDF and our true knowledge of strange from U bar and D bar, that remains very, very challenging. So what we continue to do in service of kind of the LHC phenomenology that I'll talk a little bit more about tomorrow is try to determine this stuff with greater precision and accuracy, of course, than what we know at the present time. And to somewhat preview what will be, yes?
I saw the band for charm.
Yeah.
Is this the paper with the intrinsic charm, or is it just generated by DigLab?
So this is entirely perturbative. Yeah, so the question concerns very tiny here, this, I don't know what that is, the sort of golden or yellowish line. This thing here is the charm PDF. The charm mass, effectively, the pole mass is something like 1.3 GeV. So this is just slightly larger than that scale. And you can get the sense that actually this is basically zero, except for at very small X where you get some sort of upturn. And indeed, that's because the charm production in this calculation is driven entirely through sort of gluon splitting, through DGLAP, exactly as you say. You could try to relax that assumption and investigate, well, imagine that I have some sort of flexibly parameterized charm, albeit with a very small normalization. You could conceivably get some kind of valence like hump, maybe it's slightly high X for the charm sector as well. And that's also remains, a topic of active investigation. I think I might have something to say about it later in the talk. Yeah.
I apologize if you
No.
I said this already, but how do you measure the PDF specifically for the different quarks, sorry?
Yeah, well, remember, you don't measure the PDFs of
sorry.
work.
For the U.
No. Yeah, exactly. So right. So the idea is, I can go back a couple clicks here. The idea is right. So for every flavor, and there's not actually a unique way necessarily to do this. So I might write down a parameterization of this type for U valence and D valence and the gluon. And so there's a complete parameterization for the full flavor dependence in the unpolarized sector, or I can write it down sort of flavor by flavor. And then at that point, it indeed is just the data teach me, assuming I have good data and I understand them well, and I have a good higher order calculation at my disposal and all of that in principle, then I just unbury that parameterization from the data.
But
yeah,
if you go to the one, how do you?
Yeah.
How can I say this was okay? Not say we're going back and forth.
Yeah, you never can. So that's the tricky thing. I mean, you might have. So maybe one way of answering your question.
But like for a specific PID.
Did you say it again, please?
A specific PID, like you say, I'm gonna. For this event, I require, I don't know, like a pi plus.
Yes, so that sort of thing definitely helps, and that's what I was gonna say. So imagine you had. Let me take a better example. Maybe you have singly inclusive kaon production, for instance, and you say like, okay, I think that process is really predominated by, the strange content of the proton fragmenting to a kaon, and I think I have good theory to predict all that. You have a process where you say like, look, I think I have very good sensitivity to that specific flavor. And you're right, you could do something similar, for all of the other flavors where you've got some sort of maybe final state tag or something. But even then, right, it's never one-to-one, right? Inevitably, so a lot of these data that we tend to use where we think we've got good factorization and all that under control, like this is all just inclusive. So it's just I just see an electron in the final state. It's just the good old DIS cross section basically. But indeed, yeah, some of the other data. So okay, like W production, for instance, there's again maybe some sort of charge current that couples to different flavor currents inside the proton that gives me some kind of discrimination power. But in totality, I have all of these different things that in principle help me to do this. But if I go to somewhat lower X, it becomes very problematic, right? It's actually, I don't have very good clean resolving power on the flavor dependence, and that's part of the problem. So we're always on the lookout actually for sources of empirical information that actually help in that respect.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure. So, and indeed, actually, it's a subject that interests me. So very often, it might be the case that our knowledge of a particular PDF flavor is especially limiting in something that we care about, actually. So maybe some precision in the electroweak sector is really closely tied to how well we understand the strange content of the proton, and that indeed is the case, actually. So that's actually an interesting aspect. So so far I've only talked about deeply inelastic scattering and everything up to this point, but of course what this is giving, again, some of my own personal motivation and context. Even higher energy measurements at the Large Hadron Collider, where of course the name of the game very substantially is trying to test the standard model, search for signatures of perhaps undiscovered new physics, as high energy physicists like to say, so BSM. A lot of that depends on, of course, on our knowledge of the structure of the proton, right? Because most of the, certainly the program at the LHC, but in general, a lot of the physics that relies on standard model or entails standard model tests ultimately has hadronic bound states at some point involved, right? So if I want to measure, as I was actually just saying, so say an electroweak process, if you'd like, so just maybe even inclusive W or Z production, right? Now I have a different factorization theorem, but one that very closely resembles what I just showed for DIS, right? So I have proton coming in and scattering with another proton. So I've got now a couple of PDFs involved. And then there's some sort of perturbatively calculable partonic interaction, some sort of hard scatter. I'm not sure there's an extra little caret there, but this sigma hat basically is just the partonic scatter, right? That I can calculate maybe to next deleting order in QCD, and also maybe with some sort of electroweak corrections as well. And the crucial thing is that basically how well we know the internal structure of the proton actually can be a crucial limit, basically, to say you want to do better and better in the Higgs sector or whatever. So our knowledge of basically the deviations of many of these predictions from the standard model prediction, that baseline for the standard model physics, that can really crucially depend on our precision in the PDFs. So that was a little bit of kind of a bit of a just an intro on some of the motivation. The PDFs, however, it's not just that practical motivation. They're also very much fundamental to just our basic understanding of QCD, as I think many of you surely appreciate. So in addition to basically telling us about things at the LHC or other facilities, our knowledge of the PDF somehow ultimately boil down to things like how exactly does the mass of QCD bound states emerge exactly in detail. The PDFs has something to say there. There's the flavor structure, actually, as we were just saying. So whether there's any signatures of, if you'd like, a kind of flavor symmetry violation in the proton. What's the strange or charm content? I think we had a question about a moment ago inside the proton. The origin of spin, the nature of the nuclear medium exactly, and how that somehow imparts some correction to the structure of just a nucleon level bound state. These are all active questions, actually, and they're what I'm trying to say is they're core basic QCD questions, right? So it's not just about the practicalities of getting a somewhat better prediction for Higgs physics. It's also about just trying to say how well do we really understand QCD as a theory and how it gives rise to bound state structure. Okay, and just incidentally, I'd also stress, okay, these various subjects that I just mentioned a moment ago are all very much sort of banner motivations for the EIC. I'm not going to spend a lot of detail on this. So, okay, the EIC, everyone, you're all here, you know about it. We're excited. We've been excited for a few years now. Things are moving along, of course. The few various subjects that I just mentioned a moment ago, of course, the origin of mass in QCD, right? So if you ask, okay, why do you waste something rather than nothing? Your immediate answer, at least many audiences that I talk to, people usually allude somehow to the Higgs mechanism, I think, because they've read things in the popular media. But of course, the Higgs mechanism, sort of the Yukawa couplings of the Higgs to various standard model fermions is essentially responsible for generating a kind of current mass, right? But not the constituent substantial large mass that is responsible for like 99% of the mass of the nucleus, say our mass, why you weigh something. That latter effect really comes more from the fact that QCD, if I have basically a free uninteracting quark, but actually dress it with exchanges of strongly interacting or strongly coupled gluons, that itself generates an mass energy density, if you'd like, and that is really the origin of a great deal of essentially your mass, right, inside the proton. And it turns out that you can actually theoretically derive sort of decompositions of the mass of the proton. There are various sort of like, it's actually various different matrix elements that contribute, but actually somehow actually a good deal of that boils down to basically just the momentum that the quarks carry inside the proton, and that can actually be parameterized, of course, through the PDF, so that there's a connection there. There's also the question of the flavor symmetry breaking that I mentioned a moment ago. You might naively expect at very high energies that in basically D bar, and so in the C of the proton, D bar and U bar are basically exactly identical or symmetric, if you'd like to say. But at much lower energies, there can be dynamical processes in the proton that are responsible for basically breaking that symmetry, such that there can be a flavor asymmetric C, and that actually is a significant motivation for some of the fixed target Drell-Yan measurements that I mentioned a little bit earlier at the very start of the talk, for instance, at E866 or sequest. So you'd like to somehow try to parameterize that sort of thing. At leading order, the process is somehow related to PDF ratios, but the true full calculation, of course, again, as I keep trying to say, it's an inverse problem, and in fact, there's a full higher order calculation such that you can't simply unvary things, and you have to do a full global fit to try to look at something like D bar over U bar and see is there indeed a non-negligible flavor symmetry breaking. our knowledge of nucleon strangeness, as I mentioned a moment ago, remains very poor. And there's still this really intriguing notion of, is there some sort of non-perturbative charm component of the proton, the intrinsic charm it's sometimes called? And that's a question that still, I think, remains substantially unresolved. There have been some hints that perhaps there could be some small intrinsic charm component, but different analyses find somewhat different things. So I think the jury is still somewhat out on that. So these are all questions that relate to how well we understand the PDFs again. There's the origin of spin. So of course you can, instead of just unpolarized sort of matrix elements, you can look at things that are actually sensitive to helicity PDFs. I think we had a talk, maybe it was last week, or a series of lectures by one of my colleagues on that very fascinating subject. So again, very much the same sort of thing. And then I'm not going to talk about this much at all, but of course, the connections to nuclear structure are really deeply fascinating, right? What happens when you take a proton, or a nucleon, I should say, and embed it in the nuclear medium? Does it somehow act like a loose bag of nucleons that are weakly interacting, or is there something else entirely different that happens? Are there sort of short-range correlations, as have been argued? So in fact, if you try to operationalize some of those physical pictures in now a nuclear PDF global fit, you can try to get relevant information to help answer those types of questions. So that, again, that's all kind of on the side of just motivation for this subject. Just to return to ask the question, how exactly are the PDFs really accessed systematically in a global fit? Again, I'm somewhat rehashing what I mentioned ago. So I have some formal definition for the PDF that I try to parameterize things. And then I have some kind of factorization theorem. For Drell-Yan, of course, the factorization theorem very closely resembles that for deeply inelastic scattering. There's a lot of notation here, but it again boils down to my ability to perturbatively calculate some sort of short distance matrix element, and then my knowledge of the PDFs of the two colliding protons, right? And then there are various logarithms that enter the factorization that can problematize our ability to calculate things and that have to somehow be controlled in a systematic way. There's also, I alluded to this a little bit earlier, but there's also the question of somehow kinematically matching basically a physical observable basically to the PDFs and so on, or at least the sorts of invariants that enter the PDFs. So it gets fairly straightforward in deeply inelastic scattering in the sense that basically it's the virtuality of the exchange boson that sets the sort of the factorization or a normalization scale of the PDFs. And it's X Bjorken that I map to the true sort of partonic invariant, the longitudinal momentum fraction of the quark. I can relate those to sort of directly. These are all leading order relations, these sort of Born level matchings. Then you do similar things for different observables. So for hadron-hadron collisions in general, I can somehow map things like, maybe this is singly inclusive production of, I don't know, like a W boson, as I mentioned a little bit earlier. And basically I can match the rapidity of the final state boson to the momentum fraction probe there. And again, there's some natural scale setting. And you go about this sort of process by process. And in general, an intriguing question is the role of higher order corrections that play some role basically in setting some kind of uncertainty. Because in general, these matchings, as I keep saying, are entirely leading order. But in fact, if I were to carry them out more systematically to higher orders, I would get a somewhat different result. And so there's some sort of higher order uncertainty that is relevant and something that we care to calculate in general. I'm down to, I think, the last 15 minutes or so, so I'll just quickly give you some more technical detail, of course, on how these various things go, of course. But so, I mean, the scale dependence, I alluded to this a little bit more loosely earlier in the talk, of course. QCD evolution, or the Altarelli-Parisi evolution, of course, is what allows us to unbury the behavior of the gluon PDF as well. So if I have, say, a quark PDF at a given scale, in general, I can solve a series of coupled integral differential equations that tell me basically how the PDFs of one flavor relate to another flavor. And so they boil down basically to convolutions of the PDFs, either for quarks or gluons, with perturbatively calculable splitting functions that, in sort of leading order, leading order, the quark splitting function looks something like this. Of course, it's governed by the radiative process of gluon emission. And it's actually something of basically a homework exercise to try to calculate this. And again, as I keep saying, you can of course go to higher and higher orders in calculating the DGLAP running to greater QCD accuracy. Once you know that, basically, then if in principle, if I've determined the PDFs, imagine magically I've determined the PDFs very, very well at a given fixed scale, basically this mu that I keep showing, or equivalently Q. If I know that and I know the DGLAP splittings very well, then in principle, what I can do is I can simply evolve these distributions from a relatively low scale. This is comparable to sort of the parameterization scale for the global fit, up to much higher energies, of course. And what you find, literally, essentially to first order, is that a lot of the sort of shift to higher momenta, to the higher mu in this case, or the higher Q, is governed again by the behavior of the gluon PDF, which is peaked at very low X. And so what you find is an initially very valence-like shape at 2 GeV, for instance, for the up or the down quark. As I convolute more and more with the high X the very low X peaked gluon distribution, what happens is that things sort of shift very rapidly down to low X, and I get shapes that increasingly look more and more sort of C-like in general. So again, this is really related to some of the questions that we keep hearing. So in principle, not only do I have data from many different measurements and many different experiments, I also have this crucial issue of sort of the scale dependence too, where those measurements maybe live at very different scales, and I have this sort of running that relates information across those scales. So that lets me determine both how fast these things evolve, that tells me about the gluon PDF, but also allows me to get constraints to the PDFs across a range of different physical scales. Of course, as I just said a little bit ago, there's some sort of very intriguing interplay between the valence and nucleon C, basically, where the valence, of course, is some sort of charge odd object to sort of a Q minus Q bar type combination, and the C is really driven by our knowledge of the anti-quark PDS. And these are respectively sort of peaked at high and low X effectively, as is shown in a fairly recent global fit parameterization. One other thing that I'll just quickly mention, the time is running a little short, so if there's interest in discussion, we can go into this in a little bit more detail. But as I was just saying, the fact that the PDF fits traverse a wide range of different scales means that sort of the natural number of heavy quark degrees of freedom that enter a given calculation is sort of a dynamical quantity. So as I go over the scales Q, basically I basically activate more and more heavy quark degrees of freedom. And the question is then, do I treat those as basically massless partons that contribute to the PDS of the proton, or am I at a scale where things are very basically comparable to the mass of the heavy quark, in which case I have to somehow take account of the heavy quark mass in the perturbatively calculable Wilson or hard scattering coefficients, basically, in the calculation. So this is a subject that definitely remains really kind of in the fine-grained detail of doing the perturbative calculations for the global fits, and is another frontier. Exactly how you do this, there are various prescriptions and so on. So I won't spend a lot of time on that. The very last subject that I'll discuss for a few more moments is this question about, okay, we've given some sense for the basics of the PDF determination, what they mean, et cetera, et cetera. There's also this question of the uncertainty or the flexibility, basically, in trying to parameterize the PDS. There are two main approaches in general that are commonly used by practitioners in this area. Actually, in any case, what you do is, as I keep saying, you write down some sort of parameterization at a relatively low scale, an initial parameterization scale. Very often it might be something comparable to mass, but something in the ballpark of maybe 1 GeV roughly. And in general, we have some expectation for the very, very high X and very, very low X behavior. That's usually parameterized through this good old-fashioned sort of X to the alpha, 1 minus X to the beta, or I named the parameters slightly different here, but that's the usual. But then at intermediate X, there's some sort of more flexible parameterization that encodes how things are actually going. This might be just something like a polynomial parameterization in many of the current fits, where you actually have a specific sort of analytic form. For instance, inside the CTEC family, that typically does take such a polynomial parameterization, then overall you end up with something like maybe 30 parameters to tell you the full sort of flavor dependence of the PDFs. That's just one approach, and that's just one essentially parameterization choice. You can make various other parameterization choices. Our colleagues in, for instance, the neural network PDF collaboration, NNPDF, instead of using a specific polynomial parameterization, they still have what they call these sort of pre-processing that gives you the very, very high and low X behavior. But then at more intermediate X values, they actually encode the X dependence in some sort of neural network, which is, again, just another parameterization choice effectively. And the crucial thing that I want to mention just in the final moments of this talk is the fact that there are kind of corresponding approaches for the uncertainty determination in these various approaches. So on this top approach with the actual analytic parameterization form, typically one might formulate sort of eigensets that tell you about that basically tell you about the PDF uncertainty. Whereas in this case, at the bottom, the neural network parameterization approach, maybe there's some sort of large set of sort of Monte Carlo ensembles that collectively tell you about sort of the uncertainty that I was showing a few slides ago, essentially the band for the PDF, basically. This is that actually shown explicitly. So on the left, many groups, some of the CTEC family, but also MSHT and a number of other groups, MSHT used to call themselves MMHT, actually release a relatively small number of eigensets in a sort of Hessian parameterization that, okay, I know my optimal best fit, and then basically I take excursions away from that best fit in a number of different directions in a diagonalized parameter space. And each of those excursions then corresponds basically to one of the lines shown in this tangle of plots. And collectively, then those tell me about the PDF uncertainty. The Monte Carlo approach that's common, for instance, in NNPDF, for instance, now in this case, what I have is maybe something on the order of like 1,000 Monte Carlo replicas. And basically the standard deviation over that large family tells me about the PDF uncertainty. And you can actually toggle between these approaches. And again, understanding their properties or more modern approaches is very much a subject of ongoing research. What it is, though, and what it boils down to, again, is the fact that we don't actually know the true underlying parameterization. So in general, there's always this motivation to try to understand how much flexibility is actually needed in a particular fit. And that degree of flexibility parameterizes maybe to, that degree of flexibility relates to maybe the number of degrees of freedom in the Hessian approach, for instance, how many actual fitting parameters, or the size of the neural network in the neural network approach shown at the right in that case. And those are just examples of the PDF uncertainty. There are actually various others. We had a question a little bit earlier about, I think about basically how do uncertainties, be they statistical or something to do with maybe correlated or uncorrelated systematic uncertainties in actual experiments, how do those propagate downstream to the PDF uncertainty? That's a very good question. There's, of course, the theoretical uncertainties. For instance, the fact that in general, I do a calculation only usually to a fixed QCD order, or maybe a fixed electroweak order, and that choice imputes some sort of an uncertainty on the PDFs. There's this issue of the parameterization that I mentioned, but then there are also subtler things to do with actually just the methodological choices made in global fits, of which there are actually very many. And somehow one has to combine these various things together, and it's incredibly non-trivial trying to do so. I had a bit of a statistical interlude, which I think I'm going to skip, about how things go in the Hessian fits. And I think I'm more or less at the end, but what I'll just quickly say again is return to this fact that, okay, what actually happens inside the global fit, right? So in principle, we have many, many different processes that we try to fit, that we try to describe so the best that we possibly can, that collectively maybe have some particularly strong sensitivity or pull, as we had asked a little bit earlier, to specific flavors. But in general, those polls are approximate, right? Like it's never one-to-one. And again, I keep emphasizing this point. But what we would actually like to make some sense out of this very convoluted black box, right, of the PDF global fits. And so what we would like to do in general is try to have some identification for how a particular set of data might tell us about a specific flavor. You can get some idea of that just from your knowledge of the basic physics and from drawing Feynman diagrams and so on. But we're always on the lookout for other approaches that might tell us about the specific poles of various data on specific flavors. There are ways of doing this. For instance, one not naive, but at least it's sort of like a brute force in a sense approach is I might actually just do what's called a Lagrange multiplier scan. So this is the ratio of the D, not D bar over U bar, but D over U at relatively high X and at a low scale. And the idea is that basically I can toggle or continuously vary rather the value of the PDF at that specific point over a range of scales, deviating from maybe the best fit choice or the best fit in a fit like CT. And what you find is that as you go away from that sort of best fit point, the various chi-squareds shift in differing directions for different measurements. So what you might find is that some data sets, like maybe 8TeV jet production from CMS, actually prefer a larger value of this ratio of D over U, whereas different experiments have very different choices. And actually, there are various techniques that we've tried to develop to somehow map basically those different poles and sort of data-driven preferences from various data sets on the PDFs. You can basically rank experiments accordingly. So that's another bit of sort of technology where we're always on the lookout to try to understand what's happening inside the global fits. The last thing I think I was going to say is just to spend a moment alluding to the fact that, of course, everything I've been talking about is at the level of single hadrons, and of course, specifically the proton, as is most relevant for LHC phenomenology for the most part, or PP scattering anyway. But of course, you can extend things very much beyond the level of just the individual free nucleon, right? You can look at nuclear PDFs, and I think we might have some other talks later in some other lectures in this school on that subject. There are many different families of analyses and approaches in this subject. Naturally, I, for fun, choose, of course, CTEC or the NCTEC approach, where basically the idea is that you basically parameterize and fit the nuclear PDFs, in this case, directly. And directly means you actually write a nuclear distribution in this fashion, and you have explicitly parameters associated for the PDF in the nucleus, rather than actually fitting some sort of nuclear correction factor, as is sometimes done in other groups. But the basic approach is still the same. However, I now need data involving nuclear targets, of course, to tell me about the nuclear PDFs, and those come from various sources. A reason I mention it, of course, is because there's absolutely a deep relevance to this, again, to fundamental particle physics, which is, again, my guiding motivation, which is, of course, things like the deeply underground neutrino experiment, where there's a significant contribution to a measurement like this from nuclear deeply inelastic scattering, maybe something like half of the events, roughly. So it comes down to how well can we model basically neutrino scattering on a target like argon, for example. And so this really motivates ongoing efforts, basically, to try to determine the nuclear PDFs as well. There are intriguing ties to attempts to describe beyond standard model physics in parallel with the PDFs that I'll talk about this just a little bit more tomorrow, because there's an intriguing interrelationship there. And with that, I think that's sort of the idea for today, the conclusion. So again, what I've tried to do is give you some overarching flavor for some of the open topics in this subject. Obviously, again, just to repeat the obvious, the collinear PDFs are really, really vital to our ability to do things both on the theory and experiment side in HEP. But it's not just that, of course, right? The PDFs encode how well we understand QCD as a theory, both on the perturbative and non-perturbative side. So with that, tomorrow, the idea is I'll try to more directly relate some of this stuff to our understanding of things at the LHC and how the EIC and LHC programs in some intriguing way we expect them to somehow talk to each other. So with that, yeah, thank you so much. I look forward to discussing more in the discussion, and I appreciate your attention. So, thanks.
Thank you. Again, we'll have the discussion session this evening, but there are a couple of questions now. We have time for that. So,
yeah, please.
So if there are two groups, and they extract these PDFs, there's tension between them.
Right, right.
What do I do if I'm trying to extract some BSM physics in like a PP context?
Yeah, so that's a really good practical question. Yeah, use the CTEC PDFs as the. That's right. What do you do? I think there are various efforts to try to get around this subject or to provide some sort of guidance to people doing on the fly analyses, whatever the scope is. So there's an effort that I'm involved with called PDF for LHC, where the idea is like, maybe I take some of the main fitting groups and try to statistically amalgamate them in some fashion where I get a kind of envelope that encodes the uncertainty from, oh, I've got this one and I've got this one. And you don't want to somehow bias the resulting analysis by just saying, well, I took the CTEC one, of course, because why would I do anything else? In practice, I think that's kind of the right approach. I mean, if you doing your calculation don't know, then I think you have to do both, and somehow, you know, that is a crucial uncertainty, right? And that's indeed what I tried to say a little bit earlier. There is a PDF uncertainty that should be very carefully quantified, whatever it looks like. So if you're trying to set some sort of, you know, limits on some supersymmetry scenario from this batch of data or something, that yeah, there's a PDF uncertainty, and it's not just the PDF uncertainty from a given analysis, but past that, you might have some reasons for choosing one set or another, actually, like joking aside. It's possible that maybe this analysis actually accounted more carefully for some sort of electroweak corrections that might be particularly relevant in the channel that you're studying and so on. The other thing that I'll mention, maybe in an attempt to kind of address your question slightly, especially given the BSM connection, is this is really, really topical, right? So I actually don't have here's the answer and that's it. It's actually very troubling. And so when I was a PhD student, it occurred to me, you know, if I'm trying to identify some signal for BSM in hadronic data at the LHC was just starting at that time, but so there weren't many data. But imagine I wanted to do this. And in general, I've used many of those same data to try to extract the PDFs that set the baseline, right? Isn't there a circularity in this? And indeed there is, right? And in practice, our hope is that the correlations between sort of the tunable degrees of freedom that you might use to parameterize the BSM in whatever your theory is, and the actual PDF fitting parameters, if you tried to fit them to the same data, that those correlations are very weak. That does seem to be the case. And so we had a study fairly recently on TT bar and jet production, where basically the idea in this plot is actually illustrating the shifts in the PDS, so the high X gluon, as I activate some sort of BSM sensitive Wilson coefficient. And what you find is the effect is like tiny, which is good. Well, I don't know. If you want to have a really, you know, exciting paper, it's not good because you'd want to see a huge correlation and say, you need to fit the PDS and the BSM simultaneously. But if for those our colleagues who are very much engaged in doing the BSM fits of hadronic data, I think it's encouraging that actually, at least for top and jet production, it's a fairly weak correlation. But in practice, what you really want to do is somehow try to avoid the bias of just saying like, well, I chose these PDFs and now I'm going to set exclusions or whatever. So because they're definitely related. So yeah. We can talk more about that in the discussion too. That's a subject that really interests me. So yeah.
It is known at which X the gluon distribution decrease, as you shown, for example, in contrast at the up and down part distribution.
Sorry, I may not have missed the very first part. At what X the gluon distribution? What?
Decrease.
Where it decreases. So meaning going to high X or
high.
Yeah. Yes. So I mean, of course, there's a PDF uncertainty associated with this, but yeah, I mean, in general, if I'm working at a given fixed scale, then naturally, of course, the gluon PDF has to come off at high X. But yeah, it's possible I'm not quite getting the.
Because I think it's not possible that gluon distribution grows indefinitely. So that is enabling.
Oh, I see. Are you talking about like saturation or the?
Have shown quantum.
So, okay, so yeah, let me try to explain. So it's possible that there might be some confusion. So what's being shown on the left-hand plot is this is the gluon PDF near a parameterization scale normalized to the PDF that you would get, assuming the standard model only. And what you do is you parameterize BSM through some sort of 4 fermion contact interaction. That's this C1. So C1 is set equal to 0. That's standard model. And you could in that scenario extract the gluon PDF, and that sort of sets a normalization basically. And what's happening in this plot is we're dividing through the gluon PDF by that standard model scenario, and then varying this contact interaction away from that. So this is a ratio basically. And then the thing on the right is actually just plotting the PDF uncertainty as you vary the sort of the weightings for some of the data that are fitted in this global fit. So there's no, the normalization, the absolute gluon PDF is not necessarily falling. It's just variations as you tune this BSM sensitive parameter, if that kind of helps. Yeah. Yeah. Other questions? Yeah.
I can ask one.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's always confused me. So, you showed this F2 structure function
Sure.
as a function of Q squared.
Right.
And you show that high X, the structure function decreases with increasing Q squared
Right.
moderately.
Right.
So, at leading order, the structure function is just sort of the sum over their or PDF
Right.
times their
Right.
charge weighted squared. But when you show the leading order D-glap evolution, it seems like the terms on the right should always integrate to like a positive change with Q squared. So how do you actually get this sort of negative slope in the structure function?
So yeah, maybe I'm not quite understanding, but
So we look at like the D-glap equation.
right.
You had sort of the change of the PDF as a function of Q, the DF DQ squared.
Yeah.
And it seems that at leading order at least,
That's somewhere. This thing.
yeah, at leading order at least, all the terms on the right are positive.
Right.
And you said this is true for any order gluon PDF. So it seemed that, if you just calculate the structure function at leading order at high X, you should always see a positive increase with Q squared, but you end up seeing a negative.
Yeah, I think I'm maybe getting at what you're trying to say, but I mean, I don't know. I think it's to do with the fact that in general, yeah, obviously I write these things down sort of sector by sector, and I have the coupling. So this is quark. I have similarly sort of a quark gluon and gluon splitting. So I think when you solve the system consistently, then in general, you can always still go to a higher scale where when I convolute things with the gluon that's peaked at lower X, then naturally I still shift things to lower X, but it's possible I'm maybe not quite. Yeah, it might make sense to sit down and try to talk it.
No, so I'm wondering, because I know usually a lot of times you parameterize these D-glap in terms of, say, the valence quark.
Sure. Yes, you can, and indeed, yeah. So this assumes a particular basis, right? Of just sort of not, I think, just quark level, gluon level, and so on. And yes, you can indeed, yeah, take combinations of these as sort of like singlet and non-singlet and so on. Or I'd actually take sort of differences among the D-glap equations accordingly to get the relevant linear combination you want. Yeah.
Okay.
Anyway, yeah, we can talk about it more.
Thank you.
Yeah. No, thank you. Other questions?
So no further question. Let's thank Tim again.
All right. Thanks.
Let's take a half-hour break. We'll start at 10:40 then, so.
Okay. Thanks.
I am, sorry.
Oh, no, no,
No.